Hi guys, I'm Eros, and this is my media evaluation. So I'm going to start by giving you sort of a brief brand profile of the magazine that I made. So it's essentially a sort of graphic-based hip-hop magazine that's hitting the mainstream market and also the sort of up-and-coming market. And so we're sort of targeting two audiences at the same time, which is sort of mainstreamers and aspirers. So as far as the first question, which is in what ways does your media use, develop or challenge forms and conventions of real media products? So what I'm going to talk about here is sort of my media and the ways in which it sort of doesn't conform to or does conform to certain conventions. So the first thing I want to do is look at the conventions of a front cover. Now essentially what you'll have is a background, which generally comes from the model shot, then a masthead, which often is placed in the sort of left-hand corner. Then you'll have kickers all about, and then a central model. And that's usually in a close-up shot as well. And that's generally a conventional front cover for a music magazine. And the masthead, you'll notice, is often on one side, like NME and Q, they just have a small masthead inside. So as far as iFlow, As far as iFlow for my cover, it generally comes from the masthead down through the eyes of the model and then into the bottom right-hand corner. So NME is a magazine that I studied in terms of looking at conventions. As you'll see here, their covers are fairly conventional in that they will come down through the masthead, and here it's led through the badges towards the eye line and then down into the corner. Though I mean, you could suggest that this Simon Cowell does a more of a C shape. But see, NME again, they stick with the red masthead, which sits in the left-hand corner of the page, and obviously really big, bold kickers. So other conventions that you'll find on a magazine are badges, which are generally used for sort of snapshots of information or posters or other features of the issue. Then you'll have small like information bars or selling lines on the bottom or top of the page, and then obviously a barcode. So in terms of model shot, what you'll generally find on music magazines is you'll only see about up to the shoulders of a model, which is basically a close-up shot. That's generally the norm, as you can see here on Vibe, which is a hip-hop magazine that I took a lot of influence from. So I also looked at illustrated covers, which are fairly unconventional, but you do see them. And what they generally involve is just taking a model and then illustrating in behind them, whatever that may be. So in terms of my cover, as you can see here, what I've done is I've stuck for a fairly conventional mid-shot of my model, and then I've illustrated out from behind her. It is unconventional in the sense that it only has one kicker, which is unusual. Often music magazines will be dotted about with lots, but I chose to do that because I thought that if I put in any more than that, it would start detracting away from the illustration behind the model. The masthead, what I tried to do there was I tried to make it like a prominent brand image like you'd get with, say, a magazine such as Vibe or Wired. What that means is that you have a definite logo for the rest of the magazine to follow. And as you can see, the colour scheme straight away is sort of initiated from this cover. So you've got reds and blacks and whites, and that's generally what's going to run throughout the magazine. So as far as iFlow on my cover, it tends to come quite conventionally through the masthead, down through the eyes, down to the kicker and then into the corner. It is unconventional in the sense that there is nothing in this corner to leave the eye there. So but it does naturally flow, and I think that's partly due to the position of the model. Because if you look at the earlier shot, she's facing towards the right, which means that you're naturally drawn to her eyes and then down across her body. In terms of the conventions for contents, are fairly similar. So you'll start with a background colour, which often comes from the similar colours to the title, or you'll have a sort of running theme of a colour or a background. Then you'll have what's called a picture wall, which are lots of different shot types, often wides, shots from gigs, but here obviously I've just shown close-ups. Then you can have an artist name and a pull quote or an explanatory, and that's usually designed in music magazines to try and sell the articles, because they're heavily based upon the artists. Then you'll have your editorial pillars along the right-hand side of the page, and then an editor or subscriber note, and then obviously your title. So in terms of examples for this, as you can see here, this is an NME page. It's fairly unconventional in the sense that the editorial pillars are here, and they're surrounded by a picture wall. But you can see here the pull quotes, quite evident there. In terms of Kerrang and Q, they're very conventional contents pages. You know, they have a big picture wall and editorial pillars down the right hand side. Other examples, I looked at Vibe especially for ideas for a contents page, because though they do have the editorial pillars in the right hand side, they're very unconventional in the sense they'll have a main model and that's it. But they do have 3 contents pages, but each one is formulated like this. They'll have a central model and then editorial pillars. What I like about it is they have an interesting background straight away with that V from their masthead. It means they've got a running theme throughout, and obviously there you can see a sort of mid-shot of Kanye West. So this is my contents, and essentially I've followed Vibe's standards quite closely in that I've gone for a mid-shot of my model. And again, I've tried to make it look like Vibe does, more like a sort of front cover of the magazine. The editorial pillars are here on the left-hand side, which is unconventional in a sense, but I think that the use of the W in the background, which you can't really see on this clip, it sort of draws you down here from the contents, past these two, and then into the sort of main feature there, and obviously the prominent model. So in terms of my advert, what I chose to do was a Nike advert, which you can see here. And the inspiration I drew from that, often Nike will superimpose sort of different things onto their trainers depending on how they want to market them. For example, the meteors in the corner there, and they put flames around the front, and also if you look at the Mercurial adverts, they have sort of big fans that come off to show extra grip. And then I used a very similar font here to this advert. I mean, the new Nike adverts have a more italic font, but the older ones, which I looked at sort of in terms of the questions that they asked. And so I took the inspiration from that. Then in terms of a double page spread, what you're looking at again is your background, which usually has the recurring colour theme. Then you have an artist picture, which often takes place on the left-hand page, because naturally you read from the right to the left when you open a magazine, and that will come complete with a caption. Then you'll have your title for the page, and then a sidebar, which usually has a sort of small picture of an artist, and then some information about it that they don't want to include in the article. Here obviously you have the main article with pull quotes, then you'll have a slug in the corner, which was used for the editors to find the page, but it generally helps define the features. And then you'll have credits, and lastly an anchor and a badge. So that's generally your conventional double page spread. In terms of iFlow, you're looking at a C shape here, starting in the sort of top right hand corner. Usually that's why there's a picture at the top of the sidebar, and then it'll be drawn across the title through the model and back down. If you look at this top example here, it's an incredibly conventional double page spread in that it starts up here with this bit of the sidebar, goes through the title, down through their eyes, down to this box in the corner, and then back round. So that's a very conventional C shape, and in these two as well you'll see the titles nicely draw you into the eye line of the models. So in terms of a DPS intro page, which is something I looked at, they generally have a convention of they'll have a background which again can be part of the colour scheme or slightly different, and then they'll have usually a very close-up shot of the artist. I mean, this can differ. You can have longer shots or shots from a gig, but often it's a close-up to mid-shot, and then they'll have, say, the name of the artist and either an opening paragraph or a sort of brief pull quote, and then obviously your page number. So these are some examples of that. These are both from NME, and so the same issue actually. And you can see there how they have a sort of close-up shot of Jimi Hendrix, a short title, and then brief introduction to the article, which carries over to the next page. So this is my DPS intro, and as you can see here, I stuck quite conventionally to the idea, as in I had a very close-up shot of the model, then a title, model's name, the artist's name, sorry, and then one a pull quote and one sort of a brief introduction to the article. And so it's quite conventional in that sense, and the model's on the left-hand side with her eyes looking this way, which draws the eye over. In terms of my DPS, again, I stuck with a fairly conventional sense. As you start in the timeline, go across the title to the model, and back down to this sort of box in the corner here. And it's got all the conventions, and it has the slug, the page number, even the anchor at the bottom there. So it's a very conventional double page spread, which in some ways does contrast to earlier parts of my magazine. But you could suggest that the sidebar here, the way that's done with the tube map, is quite unconventional. and also I've put in a very graphical background, which is something you sometimes don't see in double page spreads, but I wanted it to link to my front cover. So in terms of question 2, how does my media product represent particular social groups? So in terms of model representation, I use sort of low angle shots because status is very prominent in the hip hop genre. And what you'll see is often artists will be shot from lower angles, so you can see their nostrils, which isn't particularly pleasant. But it means that they sort of have a higher status there. And in terms of clothing, they'll be wearing snapback hats, Ray-Ban glasses, and usually hoodies. And these are because they're, the snapbacks and the hoodies are particularly sort of urban streetwear that have become really fashionable recently. And the Ray-Bans are often used in sort of by major artists. So in terms of brands, for my advert I looked at Nike because obviously it's the biggest selling sports brand in the world, and also artists such as Kanye West have designed lines for Nike, such as his shoes. Then for the snapback I used Obey because it's a sort of streetwear brand, started as a graffiti chain by Shepard Fairey, and then now it's they've started making snapbacks. So it's very sort of current and cultural, and it really reflects a sort of urban vibe that I was trying to go for in my magazine. In terms of the colour scheme, I've gone for red and black mainly throughout, with some white on the titles. And so obviously, the colours red and black are really synonymous with the genre. And also the white and red titles are quite like Supreme, which is a sort of started underground, but now it's quite a big hip hop, streetwear brand in America, and it's branching over here in the UK. So in terms of what type of distribution, what institute would distribute my media, I looked at IPC Media, but I chose not to go with them because even though they do have lots of different forms of media, such as social networks, online, app form, and a print copy, I feel that NME does have some sort of a hip hop focus, and there would be a bit of cannibalism there, but they'd eat into each other's markets. So I don't think that's the appropriate way to go about things. I did look at independent publishing, which is what a lot of hip hop magazines do. If you look at The Source in America, it's a particularly big hip hop magazine which has a lot of prestige. But I feel like for the mainstream side of my magazine, independent, low circulation wouldn't be appropriate. So then I was particularly swayed by Bauer Media, because I think that even though they do the sort of conventional styles of media, they also have a sort of ticketing branch and television and radio, which means there's a greater synergy between sort of the mainstream music that you'll hear on radio or see on TV and the main major ticketing events and the brand itself, which means you can have a lot of media convergence there. In terms of Bauer divisions, you can see they're mainly print, but there is also quite a big focus on radio and television. Radio especially, because that's sort of the home of music. In terms of their portfolio, they have Kerrang!, which is the biggest selling music magazine weekly, but it is purely indie rock based, and even Q is sort of mainly rock based. So I feel that there's a gap in their portfolio for a sort of mainstream hip hop magazine, because they are looking at sort of mainstream indie rock and mainstream rock there. So I think that my brand would fit quite happily alongside them. In terms of audience, what I like what Bauer do is, instead of grouping their audience as one, they like to split them up into 3 different sections and segment them, but still apply with them in the same sort of the same magazine. So, for example, mine would apply to the mainstreamers, your aspirers, and your hipsters. And your brand could happily sit in the middle of all 3 of these groups. In terms of who would be the audience for my media, I'm looking at a reader profile of between 14 and 25 years old, usually a student or a creative type. So instead of core demographic is that. The social grade for the NRS would be B, C1E, because I'm looking at creative industries but also the student market, not so much manual labour, hence the gap there. In terms of the ACORN measurement, I'm looking at aspiring singles, or aspirers in general. So the 2 main sort of sides I'm going for are your mainstreamers, your mainstream sort of hip hop fans, and obviously your hipsters. And also your sort of other one. So in terms of my reader profile, I'm looking at something that's really centred around new media like Facebook and Twitter and phone, and I think that that's what Bauer lets me do, because it really lets me link them all, and also I think that that's key to hip hop because that's becoming something that's really urban and mainstream. So in terms of how I attract and address my audience, looking at sort of language I use, such as crepes, which is defined as good-looking trainers likely to be worn by rude boys, whips, which is like a nice car, and mixtapes, underground records. And I think that's really, they really fit with the genre, as well as they sort of, what they do is they allow for language that's readable from a mainstream perspective, but also is started underground, so that gives you both dynamics again. And then here again you've got cribs, which is sort of your home. And so that's addressing it from, MTV have a show called Cribs, so it's a sort of mainstream way of fitting in with this hip-hop genre. In terms of cover images, what I've used is sort of helicopters and obviously the Brooklyn skyline, and then sort of money stacks. And I think that these, the money and the helicopters, they're incredibly, linked to this idea of, hip-hop almost being like massive movie stars. I mean, they sort of, these themes are prominent in all the songs, and so I think that that's quite attractive in terms of a mainstream market. And I think that the Brooklyn skyline is particularly important because I want to look at the American influence on my magazine. And in a sense, the American influence, the whole idea of Brooklyn, where hip-hop was brought up, very mainstream, view of things. And in terms of my artists on the front cover, their clothes are heavily American-based, and they have flat caps, hoodies usually, low-slung jeans, and a bit of bling. And that's generally what you're looking for in sort of a mainstream American rapper, and I carried that into my magazine because it is really, it's really known for that sort of mainstream aspect of things, and obviously shades. In terms of clothing items, I've looked at a few of them, but also bandanas or do-rags, and they kind of attract, because all of these things are available to a consumer, especially a mainstream consumer, but they're also worn by sort of people prominent in the genre. My advert, again, I've talked about Nike and how it's sort of a globalised sports brand, but at the same time it's sort of known as being an urban brand, and so that gives you, again, the mainstream market. In terms of new technologies that I've learned from the process, I want to talk to you about Photoshop. And so, for example, to build up my cover, I started with an image of the Brooklyn skyline, and then I worked on my masthead, put that on, and then my model shot, my kicker, and then what I did is I illustrated out from behind my model, and then put on the barcodes and kickers, and that's how I constructed it. In terms of making the masthead, I started off with a general font, and then I filled it in using the brush tool and the paintbrush tool, and I sort of proceeded to do so until you end up with a really rough version. And then what I did is I took the eraser and I just crispened up all the lines. You can click and then shift, and you can get really straight lines. So that allowed me to get a really crisp masthead there. In terms of Blogger, I use this to upload sort of all of my work onto the internet, and it's incredibly simple to use. Just new posts, and you can embed stuff, especially from SlideShare, which allows you to take sort of PowerPoint presentations and PDF documents and turn them into sort of embedding code. And so there's a great synergy between Blogger and SlideShare that allow me to put all of my work onto the internet. In terms of looking back at my previous task and looking at progression, if I look back at my school magazine here, my front cover and my content page, what you can see mainly about them is that there's an issue with the model shots and the photography. You see, if you look at the front cover here, the model shot isn't particularly good. It's got a very busy background, which is quite unconventional in magazine terms. Also, it doesn't say too much about the school aside from the background there. And if anything, the model shot, the model's actual position is a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm not really happy with the neck there. And if you look at this one, the way I've laid out the contents page, it doesn't really fit with the images that I took. And so, perhaps these lines, this line here is too steep, which means that most of my model is cut off. So if we look at, the front cover analysis, in terms of eye flow, it is fairly conventional in that it starts at the masthead, goes down through the model's right eye, and then into the kicker. And that's something that I carried through to my main magazine, if you look. However, I think there is a difference in that the masthead on my main magazine is just so much more crisp and clean, and I think it really gives a better brand identity to that. And I think that the general model shot, the background of my main cover allows the model to become more prominent, which I think is incredibly important. Looking at my contents page here, I've already talked about how the pictures aren't quite right, but also if you look up to the top of the contents, you'll see that it's really quite barren up there. And looking back to the examples that I gave, it's very, very rare that you'll find such an empty content. And you know, there's very few editorial pillars, and you know, there's simply just page numbers here and no actual information about them. Comparing it to my new contents, what you can see here is like the brand is prominent in my new contents page. You know, be it the W in the background or the waved up in the left corner, but it's really sort of coming through, and I think that that's something that's going to miss in the first content. And even though the premise of the you know, the pictures being sunken in is quite nice, it makes it harder for you to see the models. Whereas here the models are really clearly set out and you can read what their articles are about. So that's it. Thank you all for listening.
I've just got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you decide on a circulation? Would it be monthly or weekly, or what were you thinking?
Sorry, I was supposed to say that in my brand description. It's a monthly circulation because I decided that unlike sort of magazines like you know, NME, there isn't enough covered in my magazine to sort of suffice weekly. I don't think that there's enough of a market there to have a weekly magazine. And also, if you look at the quality of the publication, it looks like a publication like Q that has more sort of graphic-based covers, you know, like the one I showed of Dave Grohl with the fire coming out of his mouth. And so I think it would have to be a monthly magazine.
Okay. And do you think you would consistently stick with an illustrator's style, or do you think that it would change month on month?
I think it's fairly flexible. I mean, I chose an illustrated style for this one because the premise of the magazine was sort of up-and-coming artists, especially female rap artists. And so I thought that that needed to be a more prominent side of the magazine, because if it was done normally, it wouldn't draw attention to the sort of rarity of that happening. And so that's why I went for a graphic cover. But I think, you know, it could change monthly. If you look at magazines like Guitar World, they tend to shift between sort of illustrated covers and normal model shots, especially if I say a group.
Okay. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Well done.